I wanted to ask you about preparedness and ad-libbing and the way that those two things interact, because I've had like an obsessive focus on having all of my documents ready and accurate and detailed before I shoot anything. And now I've seen a few cases where that is the case, but people are very, very calmly willing to deviate from those things, shoot new stuff, light as they go, block as they go. And I not only wanted to ask, like, what is the most prepared you have been, but also what is the most unprepared you have been and been able to like keep working. And how do you keep working if you're super underprepared? How do you ad lib when you're super prepared? Lots of thoughts in that one run-on sentence. I hope you can tolerate that.
What do you think?
Well, I think that my aversion to ad libbing is a really, really basic stress. I am much less stressed out when I know exactly what I'm going to do. I think it's also like, do I have the knowledge to ad lib sort of thing, where I'm not entirely sure if I actually know how to ad lib, because I apply all of my knowledge prior and my on the spot knowledge might not be strong enough, which is why I've planned so aggressively for so many things. I'm trying to be more chilled out with the stuff that I'm shooting now, but like, try not to worry about it too much. Just, go with the flow. But also, I've seen a lot of people go with the flow too hard and it just falls apart. And there's no, this person should be lit this way, the space should be lit this way. It's just like, let's just expose stuff correctly. And there's not enough time to think about how to do it well. There's just time to think about how to do it, if that makes sense. So I've erred on the side of like caution, which for me is planning.
I think a good plan for me is what I'm gunning for as my minimum outcome.
Right. Okay.
If I don't see something better on the day, I know at least I'm getting this.
That's fair.
This may potentially just completely short circuit the whole episode.
Okay.
Do you need to worry about it yet?
I don't know. That's why I'm asking you. If I knew whether or not I need to ask, like, worry about it, I wouldn't ask you. I know that this isn't something I like need to know yet, but like, it's also something that's on my mind. And if I don't need to know, you can tell me that, and that can be the whole episode, 5 minutes long.
History in the making.
What can I say?
Well, just you didn't know. Put Newcast episode in history.
That's right. What we could do instead is I can say, hypothetically, is did you watch the Dune Part 2 trailer? And then I can explain it to you in detail for 40 minutes.
Let's not do that.
Okay, sure. Maybe next time.
So let's do a little detour.
Okay.
And think about music and music forms with a great deal of improvisation.
Like jazz.
For example, is preparedness and improvisation mutually exclusive?
No.
So what does the preparedness entail?
For music, you mean?
To be able to improvise in music, what kind of preparation does there need to be?
Well, you need not only a knowledge of what you're playing, but also when you can improvise and how to improvise. So you need like an innate knowledge of music and how to play whatever instrument you're doing.
How much of that is actually innate?
Innate? What do you mean innate?
And that is kind of the question, isn't it?
I see. I don't know.
In a lot of arts, what looks like improvisation often appears to the outside observer as something instinctive.
Right.
Would you agree or disagree with that?
I'd agree with that.
Here's the fallacy that a lot of people fall into, thinking that innate and instinct are the same.
Mm-hmm.
There is huge overlap, but a big part of instinct can be learned.
Yes.
So I think if we look at something like music, and I think we see it to a certain extent in graphic arts as well, like painting, illustration, whatever,
mm-hmm.
There's what I call the tyranny of talent.
Trademark that right now.
This idea that there's a minuscule elite who are just born with it. It comes from the spirits, the deities, some extra dimensional parallel universe, whatever you want to call it, that is not accessible to the masses.
So are you saying that you like disagree with that being a thing, or you
No,
think
I
it
disagree.
exists?
I disagree where it masks a lot of so-called genius.
Right.
There's a lot more work, there's a lot more learning that goes into what we in arts consider genius than the myth of the tyranny of talent.
Okay, I see what you mean.
Kind of allows for. So the tyranny is that it's keeping people down. They don't allow themselves to even try certain things because I don't have the talent.
Yeah.
Right. So what is instinct? Improvisation. If we are going to rely on instinct, it kind of helps know what instinct is, right?
Well, if I had to define it on the spot, I'd say something like sort of knowledge applied without thinking very quickly.
Yes. Well, we often kind of stop short of taking that further and examining it in a way that's useful for us is where does that internalized knowledge come from?
Consistent learning,
So,
like practice.
Yeah, if we're saying that, then it can be learned.
Yeah.
It isn't this handed down from the top of the mountain from the gods. In music terms, for example, having an instinctive, not necessarily innate, although an innate understanding of the scale and modality of scale that you're improvising within helps. But note there that there are extremely few people who innately can call that knowledge and those connections up without conscious thought.
I'm beginning to catch on. So innate refers more to like
what we're actually born with. And can you see where that mythology lies?
Right.
Because of that confusion between innate and instinct, very often we don't explore the possibility if we don't innately have the ability. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm not sure how well this analogy is going to play, but we'll see. How well do you know world soccer?
So, not at all.
But
straight up not at all.
So do you know it well enough to, having heard the debates about who's the greatest of all time, the GOAT in the last decade or so, Ronaldo versus Messi?
Yeah, I have heard that.
Yeah. So both of those are considered to have God-given level talent.
Right.
Able to do things on the pitch that it appears no other mortal human being is constructed to be able to do. And for both of them, part of this skill is free kicks, and they are both considered elite level at it. The stories from when Cristiano Ronaldo was 18, 19, I think, very, very young, where he would stay back at after training. He would grab a big net of soccer balls and he would practice his free kicks because he was not very good at them. Whereas now,
so it's
like
not
20...
it's not God-given, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Whereas now, like 20 odd years later, it's kind of like no human can do that other than this other guy. Point being that he spent extra time on top of the mandated training by the coaches on his own. And the story goes that one of his teammates would go, Ronnie, where are you going? Oh, I'm just going to go and check on something here. Like he was so embarrassed that he needed extra work on this skill that he wouldn't even tell his teammates.
Jesus.
So a lot more work goes into the instinct. And even if you have innate skill, you can add to it. And where we see elite level, genius level, it's usually not 100% innate talent. It has been added to by the individual.
Right. Okay.
If we need to build a database for our instinct, then how can we improvise before we have something in that database?
Not particularly well.
How can the subconscious draw on knowledge and connections
without those things?
The hard drive for connections is not very full.
I don't know. There's no answer to that. I'm assuming there's just you can't, right?
Until you start filling it.
Yeah.
So very often, like when you get to an experience level of art, it may look like the practitioner is improvising because that hard drive is chock full. Like very often now, I can walk on a set and it looks like I'm just pulling things out of my backside. It looks like I can walk in without preparation. But in my mind, I am now at a level where I'm walking onto every production, every little just experimentation of a lighting setup, a camera setup. I'm walking into it with 20 years of pre-production. So can I improvise more than I did when I first started? Yes.
Okay.
Do I have like a formula of split of preparation and improvisation? No, I don't.
You don't?
No. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less, because there are other factors as well, where as cinematographer, you're not only considering your own skill and your own knowledge, you're also considering the skill and knowledge of your crew. You're considering the schedule, you're considering the resources, you're considering the budget.
Right.
So there's a story of Peter Jackson when he was shooting The Hobbit.
Anecdote.
Where he was saying there were days he walked on set when he had absolutely no idea how to cover the scene.
Because of
Or
the money.
You can get
expertise.
away with it when you've got 6 camera crews on standby and 100 gaffers and grips standing by to make shit happen. Part of the preparation, and I think where it can be a bit dangerous to get too reliant on millimeter blow by blow planning is at the beginner, the student, the no budget level, how much control do you have of resources, crew, time, budget?
Like none.
So if you've planned to the millimeter
and something goes wrong,
what happens when one of those things change?
That's why I'm trying to kind of have more of a go with the flow like attitude, because I am learning, especially now that I'm outside of actual film school where I have a few more resources at hand, how quickly stuff changes or goes wrong. And in a lot of cases that's happened and we've been like, okay, we'll just shoot later when the plan's actually, full and we can apply everything perfectly. And we're all kind of coming to the realization that we can't do that because it will never happen. There's no, okay, we'll shoot later. We'll just go with the flow. Next time we will shoot as well as we can.
I think there are two elements that you can help yourself with. Number one, like I said, start kind of building the awareness of your resources in all aspects of resources. So human as well as equipment, as well as schedule. They're all resources, right? And start kind of thinking of tiers, if that makes sense.
Tiers, okay. Of priority?
If I can get A tier crew, A tier equipment, I want to do this. But if I can only get C tier equipment, then I need to consider this, etc., etc., etc. Right down to, I think, like the bottom end is like where you have the least as a kind of backup, I suppose, is what if it's only me and a camera?
I see.
Certainly from my own experience, like the planning, it starts out with being, what does this setup look like? Both on the lighting diagram and what does it look like in the actual set? And then much later in my development, at least, came that, well, okay, how do I actually make this look like this on set? There's a slight nuance there. I'm not necessarily talking about like, how do I want the image to look?
How do I want the setup to look?
Yeah, how do I want the lighting diagram to look? I think as a kind of upper level beginner, I certainly fell in the trap of kind of like spending so much time on the lighting diagram and then coming on set and go, fuck, I don't have that. And like, this actually needs 2 or 3 more crew than I'd really considered. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
This is where I'm deviating from my previous analogy of the musician. As a cinematographer, when you improvise, you're not improvising as a soloist. You're more like a conductor.
Yeah.
You're improvising a whole orchestra of resources, human, equipment, schedule. I'm guessing that this is a fairly typical journey. Started with very little planning, like being very reactive. By that, I mean walking on set and go, I like that. Okay, let me try add this. No, don't like that. Let me try something else. Oh, yeah, that's kind of, AD is yelling. Let's just fucking roll. So can you see how like that is reactive?
Yeah.
And very often it ended up with what I called lighting myself into a corner.
Oh, okay. Go on. Explain.
You light shot first and go, oh, I really like this angle for the close up. And you go, okay, so I'm going to light that. Okay, now kind of go this way and go, oh, I like that as an insert. And then you turn around and go and try and do the wide and you go,
whoops.
I got nowhere to light from. It's the way I've lit all these other angles. I've left myself no place to light from. Or you start shooting everything in one direction and then you start turning around and finding the reverses and go like, bleh, can't do anything with that. So that's the no planning. So for me, it was kind of the pendulum swing then went completely the opposite direction.
Just planning.
Yeah. As in, I've told you how I learned my coverage, did not allow myself to take any single photo without also knowing the master and the reverse, to the point that I couldn't take even social photos, to the point that I couldn't just take a still photo for the sake of exploration and the art of it.
Because you would just sit there and ruminate before you did it. Yeah.
What's my reverse? Okay, so I like the way that looks. So how am I going to match that lighting? And before you knew it, it's like opportunity cost.
Very fun at parties.
At a much later stage, then pendulum had to swing back the other way.
Okay.
Where I started doing more personal work, stills, etc., and just like do not plan, just feel, improvise. So I suspect that is a fairly typical journey.
I think everything is just a bunch of pendulum swings.
I don't like this. I need to work on this, and then we overcorrect.
Yeah.
And then we go too far in that direction, and then we overcorrect in the other direction. If I were to start my journey again, I'd want to try and do different, would be to balance it a bit more. I start building in some improvisation in the preparation. So think of it less as a kind of project-specific preparation and more like a personal development preparation.
Okay.
And I think some of that may be going against the grain.
How so?
This is kind of more minute stakey. That makes sense. So if your instinct now is a soft light, a book light,
don't do it.
go hard light.
Okay, scary. I don't like that at all.
If your instinct is wide angle lenses, go telephoto. Just kind of examine what's my gut reaction. I have to do the opposite.
And just seeing what happens to build your little hard drive.
Yeah.
Okay.
But also
like
to
that.
break yourself out of I have to plan.
Right. Because you're forcing yourself to do certain things. Is that what you mean? Like a sort of
I suspect that a lot of your planning is already starting to build on subconscious presumptions. So I think it's healthy to break those. Not all the time. This goes for everyone. Like once we start getting serious about things, we start building patterns that we fall into without even knowing it.
Yeah.
I suspect that even your small skits are a little bit too large at the moment.
You think?
Yes.
Scary. I am going to keep making them, but like
yeah,
as
absolutely,
practice,
absolutely.
But I know what you mean. Like as a way of building that hard drive, they're perhaps a bit too unwieldy. Yeah. No, I agree. They have taken a life of their own and become an actual project instead of being just a practice thing, which is fine. I am completely fine with that.
Do keep doing them. But I do feel that at the moment they're becoming so much of a project that there is more of an investment in making them work. And with that comes the need to rely on planning, as in there's less room for something
Improv
with
and
a
therefore
less known outcome.
Yeah.
So the investment in the skits seems to me to be at a level now where you need to know that you're coming out with a good outcome. Whereas I think that improvisation, I think a lot of it is about experimentation in the preparation.
Yeah, which is something that I'm kind of unwilling to do. Unless I feel like it's a system that fully works. And like the habits that I've fallen into, I'm still pretty happy with, but that's because I haven't experienced anything that makes me happier than that, you know?
So but how do you know if you're not trying something different?
Exactly, yeah. And like my system is hyper specific now. Like it's if I'm using it, I'm using it. The way that I do it is that I make my lighting diagrams, then I make my shot list, and I alter each other. I alter both of those things to match each other, and then I do my location recce and figure out what the exposure is and where the light's coming from, where I'm putting the light, and then maybe I shoot some previs, and then I put it at the end of the shot list with links to each setup for each shot at the end of the shot list. And it's like it works, it's functional, but like there isn't much room for improvisation anymore. And like
I would still try to encourage you at this early stage of your development to try and flip the process.
Oh, okay. I mean, I might.
At least experimentally.
Yeah, okay.
By that, I mean, like, do the diagrams in the shot list last.
Oh, yeah. That's the thing. I tried to do that this time. Tried to walk into the location and go, I'm going to see how the director blocks this out and then do it. And it just didn't happen because I was so focused on it being good that I fell into the old habit, you know?
But I think something more minute stake like, but there's less writing on the outcome. So find the shot, find the light. And I'm not saying like finding it in terms of like, for example, in terms of lighting of only working with available light, but experiment, iterate. And we have spoken a little bit about in classes. I think the two pitfalls with experimentation are kind of diametrically opposite. Number one is not documenting the changes you make. Typical rookie experimentation mistake. I stumble upon the greatest thing ever. And then
get too excited to document it.
Yeah, and then like a week later, I'm going to do that thing I did. The second mistake we often see with artists when they try to experiment is not changing things enough.
Yeah. Is this in the process of making actual art or practice or both?
Both.
Okay.
When I talk about experimentation, I guess talking in practice. I'm not necessarily saying that in terms of every art form, because some of art forms are ones that are less focused on a fixed outcome and more focused on a process. Filmmaking, because of the resource and an expense, the expense in both in terms of time, money, and resources in general tends to be a very results-oriented process.
Yeah, there's definitely been a few movements to change that, but they've never been permanent.
I do think it's interesting that you asked for that clarification.
Which clarification? I've already forgotten.
As in experimentation in practice or experimentation
Mm.
in making art. Find it interesting that we kind of have that distinction in filmmaking, but again,
Yeah.
sidetrack, different topic. Right. So consider it like writing. What's the biggest misconception about a new draft in writing? In student screenplays, how many drafts are actually new drafts? How many rewrites are actual rewrites? Isn't a typical misconception amongst beginner screenwriters they write draft, next number draft, and all they've done is cosmetics?
Oh yeah, I do that.
And that's what I mean by we're not iterating far enough often in experimentation.
Okay.
We do like minor changes, but we're not actually trying something different.
So you're endorsing more of in that example, kind of like an experimenting for the sake of experimenting, like iterate for the sake of it,
Yeah.
even if it doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
So let's say draft 2, you've changed
So
a plot point, not because you think it's the right thing to do, but just to see what would happen.
Well, I mean, like often, like why do you write a new draft?
The first draft isn't good enough.
So if you only make cosmetic, minute changes, what's actually going to change?
Nothing. I think I get a bit too attached to the first draft. I end up making those superficial cosmetic changes until I show them to someone else. But I think, for me at least, a lot of the times that I have ideas, at least subconsciously, of what I can change, but I avoid them. Not because, most of the time because I don't like them, and sometimes because like they might be too much work or like a complete rewrite of the script. Are you suggesting that instead I become more aware of those and then make those changes for the sake of it?
And see what happens.
Yeah.
I like a lot of that. That building of that internal library of solutions and setups, it needs a lot of variety. Very often there are attribution error in what we do and don't do as artists. I find very often, particularly early on in development, like at a certain point, you don't want to be bouncing around willy-nilly, changing styles, changing aesthetic. Like at a certain point, you want to find yourself because, I think it is easier in the longer run to have certain fallbacks. It is going to make you more efficient.
Yeah, and more consistent, which I like.
Yeah, and it is also going to make you recognizable for you. But until you reach that point, I think very often we are rejecting things for the wrong reasons, subconsciously. I mean,
like how I just described, where I'm kind of I'm either attached to the way that the story is now, or it sounds like too much work, that kind of thing.
We have a certain idea about what we'd like our style, our approach to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And very often that comes from hero emulation. Yeah. I think also some of the most fertile ground in terms of creativity is where there is resistance, where there is friction.
What do you mean? Saying, no, this is not the right way to do this? Or that there is
just general avoidance,
it?
Just general avoidance of like asking certain questions.
Oh, okay.
But very often you find this with actors. Like, no, this doesn't feel right. My character would never do that. Well, why? Very often it is because it is something that subconsciously the artist doesn't want to confront.
Right. So are you suggesting that in like a larger scale, this is about to get very psychoanalytical, it sounds like that kind of artistic experimentation is also a bit of a subconscious catharsis as well?
It can be, yes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do very often find that kind of subconscious emotional blocking of certain avenues, that's usually a sign that you should go and explore more.
Yeah.
You should go in that direction. One of the most useful pieces of advice I was given in film school, a lecturer told me, if you haven't hated your movie at any point, you haven't pushed it far enough.
Really?
If you haven't broken it,
because I hate everything that I've made.
Yeah. If you haven't broken it, you don't well know where the boundaries are.
Oh, okay.
If you push it in a certain direction and you now start hating it, then okay, I'll go pull back a little bit here. Now let's try pushing in a different direction. Still not hating that. Okay, let's push further in that direction. Further. Now I hate it in that direction. I pull back a little bit there.
Bit of trial and error.
And I think a lot of people also forget about experimentation. I'm paraphrasing, but how can it be a test if it can't fail?
That's a very good point. I feel like part of the testing yourself through experimentation thing is kind of like my unwillingness. A lot of people, especially people at our level, have an unwillingness to fail. Like a sort of, I want to experiment with this, but I also don't want to mess it up.
I guess I am trying to read a little bit between the lines, but the initial question to me had an underlying tone of, am I too rigid? Should I loosen up my approach? Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, pretty much.
I think a lot of that comes down to giving yourself that kind of safe space in pre-production, as in working on yourself rather than a particular project, which, is what practice should be, both in terms of like physical space, mental space, resource utilization. I think a lot of what I'm hearing is that opportunities are so costly that I can't afford them to fail. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, they feel costly as well because of the way that the industry
Whether
works.
that be monetary, whether it be time-wise, whether it be confidence-wise, like some sort of cost.
That's a good, I think I like your reference to confidence. I feel like people underestimate how costly a failed attempt at something is for your confidence and willingness to continue. Like that is a measurable thing when you're doing a bunch of those things,
So I think a lot of that is giving yourself a safe space to fail, to push things so far that they break. I do know that we are trying to contentify a lot of our practice, but still you are in control of what you share. You are in control of what the rest of the world sees.
I don't know if the wider mainstream filmmaking situation, I don't know if there's actually a very nice attitude to experimentation if it doesn't go well.
Well, it's either, again, with the pendulum, it's either that or it's so experimental that no one's supposed to get it.
Fair enough. I really do admire people who make experimental movies, and then when people don't like them, they go like, oh, okay, that's too bad for you, I guess.
You just don't get it.
Yeah, good for them, I think.
Yeah, finding that balance between making yourself experiment, but being able to do so in an environment that isn't too costly on all those levels we spoke about. So I do think a lot of experimentation is about like stepping outside your comfort zone. A lot of the time when we want to improvise, when we want to experiment, it's because we feel like we're in a creative rut.
Yeah.
We're just doing things the same over and over and over. And a lot of it, I think, also is about sometimes, I think inspiration is another one of those mythological parts of being an artist. For me, inspiration is about association, as in free association, as in inspiration prompts something within me. Does that make sense?
I think you may have to elaborate.
Very often we think of inspiration quite literally.
Yeah.
As in, I'm going to use XYZ quote from Shakespeare as my starting point here, or I am going to reference XYZ actual specific work of art from some other artist or whatever.
But are you referring more to like here's something that just kind of makes me want to make stuff?
Or it just bounces my brain into a different direction. So I'm not necessarily so literal and linear about inspiration, as in, stream of consciousness rather than direct quotes in terms of inspiration. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but do you mean that's been do you mean that is kind of a random thing or something prompted by other stimulus?
I guess if you do put it in those terms, like for me, that inspiration is any stimulus.
I like that.
So I think of that as a well of associations. I do find that like there are cycles where I need to kind of step back and restock the well.
Oh, okay.
If you think of inspiration as a kind of an instigator for a stream of consciousness, a stream of free associations, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if you only start with the same nuggets and you throw them down the same hill, you're more than likely going to end up with the same snowball at the bottom of the hill. Whereas if you start with a different shape that you're throwing out and you're throwing it down a different size and shape slope, then you're going to get a different result down the bottom there, right?
And you're just like every now and then, once the big old snowball that the previous nugget created has rolled itself back to being tiny, you need a new shape.
No, it's more like that's where I feel like when I'm stuck in a creative rut.
Yeah.
It's kind of like my inspiration, that the kind of instigators for my free associations, I'm going back to the same ones every single time.
Yeah.
Time to find different stimulus, different instigators, different catalysts. I wanted to ask, I can't remember which episode it was, but did you ever do any follow-up? Did you ever get any traction on the whole idea of make with friends?
Not yet. I'd like to, but I have simply just not done it yet. I haven't thought of anything to make with friends. It has been in the back of my mind for a while. I think I don't know shooting stuff in black and white, but like when you think about it, kind of a little bit. I felt a bit satisfied by all the delogging nonsense that we did. That wasn't really making something as it was experimenting with existing stimuli in different ways, and it was a lot more technical than it was creative. You know?
Out of curiosity, do you think there is an element there in terms of technical experimentation can be actually measured and there is a right and wrong, and therefore it being safer to experiment with than something aesthetic and more objective?
Yeah, definitely. Without a doubt. It's easier to be like, oh, I've done this wrong with a technical experiment, let's move on to something else. When you experiment with something creative, you've got like and it's not very good. You need to actually assess whether or not it's not very good, why, how to continue, what to do next, instead of there's no right or wrong or something to fix or something to improve. If that makes sense. There's just a lot of like, okay, let's do something else.
Yeah, no, I'm wondering also like whether kind of working at the limit or just beyond your comfort zone on technical aspects, is there also that safety net of like there is someone out there who knows how to do this right? There is someone out there to tell me, even if I did this wrong, someone out there can tell me how to do it right. Whereas on the more like creative, subjective side, it's more like if I suck, then that's more of a personality judgment. Whereas on technical parts, it's more like a knowledge judgment.
There's also a lot more of an open choice to deciding whether or not something sucks when you're being creative, I think. Like you have to sit there, even if someone else tells you that they think it isn't very good, it's up to you to make the decision that it sucks and move on. And because I normally get attached to stuff when I work on things, my immediate response is, no, it doesn't suck. Sorry. So it's a bit tougher for me to take feedback.
So there are a couple of things there that I would like to see how the kind of minute steak make with friends whether it can help or not.
Yeah.
I think on the one hand, bouncing things back and forth hopefully gives some of that variety in the process, in terms of like not iterating far enough away from your base point.
Yeah.
And also, like hopefully there's that kind of slight subconscious defense as well. Like now it's kind of sucks, but that was because someone else put in that shitty part of this.
This quarter of it wasn't my fault.
Yeah.
I already have a defense mechanism against that. Whenever I make anything with anyone, that my first instinct is to be like if I shot something or if I wrote something, I don't the make with friends situation is like a deliberately small scale item, but unfortunately I immediately think, damn, the guy who wrote that really messed it up. Everyone else did great, but the guy who wrote that, he it up so badly, like when experimenting, less inclined to listen to other people, and then when applying, more inclined to dislike what I make, if that makes sense.
If you can make it fast enough turnaround between people contributing steps, so to speak, or iterations or plot points or whatever you want to call it, the less time there is for judgment and hopefully the less investment there is in it. Because I could only spend 10 minutes on it.
I'm okay with this being kind of crappy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm also hoping that will help letting go of things. The same lecturer who told me about pushing things so hard that they break also told me that you don't make one movie, you make three.
Oh.
The one you conceived, the one you shot, and the one you end up with.
Right. Okay.
And they're all different.
Yeah.
You have to learn to love and let go. That's the key phrase.
Yeah.
Learn and let go of each of the three in turn. Otherwise, you can't make the next one. As in,
melancholy.
And until you have let go of the movie you conceived, you can't effectively shoot it.
Right. Okay. So
until you have let
go
of the movie you shot, you can't effectively finish it.
I like that.
During shooting, if you're hanging on too tightly to what you had conceived, you're not going to let the movie find itself.
Yeah, and you're also going to slow things down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in the edit, if you hang on too tightly to what you think you shot, the movie isn't going to have the room to find itself in the edit. The edit doesn't ever end.
Yeah.
It's just you decide to let go and release it into the wild.
I like that.
A lot of creation is about letting go. Whatever preconceptions you had about what you're making, you're not letting that go, your work isn't going to take on a life of its own. The faster you do things, the faster you iterate, hopefully the easier it is going to be to let go.
That circles back quite neatly to the idea of ad-libbing and kind of planning as this way of trying to grab by the throat the vision that you have, where that might not actually be sustainable. Let's say that one of the appeals of a project in the end is I'm talking about performances now, this is what I'm thinking, is like the way that maybe the dialogue sounds natural because it was mostly ad-libbed, or the kind of like that's what I'll stick with, the way that the dialogue maybe sounds ad-libbed or very, very natural. If that hadn't been allowed to happen while they were shooting, there's a good chance that project, which might be better, is non-existent and it didn't ever actually come into its own. You know?
I think, I think that's where you very often see with inexperienced productions where the final product feels over-directed or micromanaged in terms of performance.
Yeah.
So that there is this idea pre-existing that was conceived of what this performance should look and sound like, as opposed to letting their story find a voice in the interaction of the performers.
Yeah.
I think for me, preparation is mostly about stocking the well.
Yeah. You have a well stocked with 20 years of...
It's well stocked.
It's well stocked. End the episode right there.
Part of that is both inspirations and solutions, being well stocked in both. And part of that is the way my creative brain is wired. I was quite far into my career where I finally kind of made the realization, you know, the saying, that looks like a solution without a problem.
Not really.
You ever heard that?
I don't think I have, unfortunately.
Kind of coming up with solutions that seem pointless at the time.
Yeah.
That seem a bit of wasted time.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Rather than kind of address whatever problem needs being addressed right now. So like traditionally that's been seen as a bit of a critique rather than a praise. If you've done something and people go, where's the problem for this? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Have you got a bit of a...
Whereas as me, I've figured out my brain actually works the opposite way. It constantly samples solutions.
Yeah.
So when a problem comes up, I can match
it's there. Yeah.
Yeah. But you know, that might not work the same for everyone. Otherwise this saying wouldn't exist there.
Yeah.
So part of the improvisation then is being able to swap these solutions, these different ways of seeing things when you see them. There's a tendency to kind of having made and completed your work in your head before you actually go and do it.
Yeah. I have this issue where, especially if I've been allowed to ruminate on a project for a very, very long time, and like if I need to dip into a new well of inspiration, I will start listening to different music, like a different genre or something. It's where I get all of my tonal and visual inspiration is music. If I ruminate on a project for a very long time, which I'm doing right now, I've been doing it for most of the year, I will listen to the same music forever, for all the time. And eventually the project becomes, at least in my head, something different because I spent so long just thinking about it, and all the stuff that I've written down prior, which is still applicable, is a bit older, and I'm spending so much of my time thinking about it and turning it over in my head. I can return to the project and be like, this is different. This is like changed a little bit, at least in my mind, and it's become its own entity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think this is probably one area where I do think AI can be extremely beneficial for artists, is to iterate in ways that we wouldn't come up with ourselves.
Yeah, and that's...
As in,
that's
you come to a certain point and you go like, this structure doesn't work.
Yeah.
Right? What's the biggest challenge is coming up with something different enough that it actually changes. But the most common trap there, I fall in it myself. Like it's just coming up with different variations of the same progression.
Yeah, that messes me up because I get attached to the one variation.
Yeah, exactly. There are two ways of going about that. Have you noticed so many self-published writers, particularly in the sci-fi fantasy genres, like in the list of thanks, there's always a group of beta readers.
Yeah.
So I think one way is to actually get in that external different view. So that's hopefully where I'm seeing part of the functionality of the Make with Friends.
Yeah.
But I'm also wondering whether that's somewhere that AI could come in.
Yeah. One of the ways it doesn't involve
6 completely unexpected plot twists.
I have my thoughts about that, but it would be too long for this discussion. We ran through a lot of stops today. You started off by asking me if I actually needed to know when I asked about how prepared I need to be, which I'm assuming was kind of like a I will find out situation. It brought to mind the whole music analogy where you compare the ability to ad lib with someone's instinct, not to confuse instinct with innate knowledge, which brought you to our tyranny of talent, the idea that there is a certain amount of innate knowledge and nothing else that people can have. Whereas that's just mostly instinct learnt through practice piled on top of what might be innate knowledge. For example, your well of 20 years of pre-production and various inspirations, what make up your ability to ad lib and your style, but also money and available resources, if you want to be utilitarian about it, allow you to ad lib things like humans, equipment, and time. You suggested that we tier this. We have an A tier is the max. What can I do if I have the A tier humans, the A tier equipment, the A tier time? But what should I do if I only have C tier? What should I do if it's just me and a camera? Who knows? But the thing is, as you said, you're not improvising as a soloist this time. You're improvising as a conductor, which is weird and different. However, you mentioned the shortcomings of not experimenting enough and refilling your well as being a thing you need to do, searching your other inspirations.
Do we want to throw in a little summary of our minute steak improvisation, make with friends?
Yeah, and because of that conductor focus, there was a bit of a make with friends situation where if you experiment with other people in a quick context, you're more comfortable to do different things, especially if it's like 10 minutes and other people do it differently and you make it all together. That way, responsibility is siphoned between different people. You can make an excuse because of the amount of time you spent on it, all that nonsense.
That is a lot about like creating a safe space where the inevitable failures of experimentation, because how is it a test if you can't fail?
Yeah, exactly.
So to reduce the cost and consequence of these failures, find that kind of environment where the cost doesn't affect your confidence.
Which is the number one cost in the end, is the confidence. You can find money and time, but if your confidence is gone, then you won't want to experiment. Speaking of which, you mentioned that if you've never hated a project, it hasn't reached its full potential. The idea that you need to kind of push things out of your thematic and stylistic comfort zone, which I think is very clever.
Probably the first advice I got about color grading was, if you're thinking of maybe this image needs to be a little bit more blue, if you just push a little bit more blue and then a little bit more blue and a little bit more blue, you're very likely to doubt because you only see incremental changes. So the better approach is to make it blue. And then pull back.
I like that because I've always struggled with, spill my tea again. I've always struggled with color grading because I always think that the increments look too blue. So if I make it super blue and then pull it back, I'll be able to actually gauge what I want.
Yeah, and that's something that's seen with pretty much every colorist I've worked with. If we want to try something, then like go extreme, go so far that you know you wouldn't use that extreme amount of XYZ, whatever, and then pull back incrementally.
I like that. I like that a lot. I'll have to keep that in mind. You kind of reach a subconscious catharsis through like that pushing with experimentation, especially with things that you aren't willing to touch normally.
I think a lot of good, fertile artistic ground lies in what we avoid. Like the subconscious puts up blockages for a reason.
And then you mentioned the inspiration well, which makes the brain go in a different direction. If you're well, was it you were saying that you were dipping into the well or filling the well up, or both? Are you filling the well up with different things so you can dip into it later?
The second one, yes.
Yeah.
So if your well is running dry, so that's my analogy. Like when my well is running dry, I go back to the same starting points over and over again.
See, yes, that is true. Which is why you need to fill it with different music and art and movies and images and people as often as you feel like you're getting into a rut, so you can dip into it with different stuff.
A lot about the way my brain is wired. I am a hoarder of possible solutions.
Yeah.
I am a hoarder of possible inspirations. I like that. I don't know what it'd be good for. It's got no relation to any project I'm working on at the minute, but it will be good for something someday.
Yeah. You're just letting it linger in your head. I like that. And then you mentioned that creation is letting go. The idea of regardless of where your inspiration is taking you, it needs to take a life of its own, which is part of that ad-libbing process in the end. So you kind of need to be comfortable with it all the time, essentially.
I think also, like in terms of ad-libbing, that's the skill to find. I'm consciously not saying develop because I don't know how to develop it.
I don't know if, yeah.
And that is that recognition of when to let go of your preparation.
which obviously takes a while to get.
There may be shortcuts, but for me, yeah, it was a process of osmosis, I suppose.
Fill the well with like art and music and movies.